The Vanguard Xenos bioships had passed by. GFD-19/Rimward was now at the heart of their fleet. And compared to the organic drones that quested ahead of the main swarm, the true organisms of the Hive fleet were behemoths. Davrick's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing as he took in sheets of pockmarked chitin the size of small continents and toothed orifices the size of cities. The thick clusters of tendrils along its flank and underbelly writhed in the solar winds, while its maw was encompassed by two great, wicked, beak-like bone plates that looked as though they could have sheared an Imperial capital ship in half. And the worst thing about the nightmarish Leviathan was that it was coming straight towards the auger station. "Oh God, Emperor," Ancom stammered, over and over. Corday was quietly sobbing, his head in his hands. Serene just stared, the image on the view screen reflected in her wide, dark eyes. Only Krasis turned away from the display. He walked over to the worn leather of his command chair, paused, tugged his dark blue Sensorum Master's uniform straight, and sat down. His expression was unreadable, jaw locked, though in the harsh emergency lumens, he looked more haggard than ever. "Crew members," he said, his words cutting through Ancom's and Corday's despair. "In the past decades of service, it shames me to admit that I have not said this enough. Regardless, if there was ever a time, Throne knows it's now. It has been an honor to man this station with all of you." "And with you, Chief," Davrick said. He was the only one to respond. His own words felt distant, disconnected, as though he was speaking to himself from somewhere far away. His mind was sluggish, unresponsive. His breathing felt labored. A strange, detached part of his mind supposed that he was probably having a panic attack. Krasis had no more orders to give. He simply sat, watching the view screen. Davrick reached out towards his little picked capture of Amelia and Drewy, his wife and son, tacked to the side of his monitor. He would see them again, someday. He was sure of it. A fresh surge of stuttered oaths from Ancom distracted him before he could pull the pict off the side of the display. The Tyranid bioship had filled the view screens. Even as the stunned crew watched, the monstrosity's great, hooked chitin beak split apart. The maw yawned wide, impossibly wide enough, Davrick was sure, to swallow one of Darkin's moons. Its shadow fell across the auger station, blotting out the light of the stars. The structure around them seemed to shudder, as though its terror matched that of its crew. The view screen now showed nothing but static-washed darkness. It had swallowed them whole. Corday had slumped on the deck, shaking and weeping uncontrollably. Krasis was looking down into his lap, knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. Ancom had finally stopped gibbering. "Serene," he managed to say, looking over at the auger analyst. "Serene, there's something I need to tell you." She continued to stare at the now blank view screen. A sudden impact threw them all. Davrick found himself sprawling across the deck, almost on top of Corday. The station shook violently, tremors dislodging rune banks and audio systems and sending Davrick's empty recaf tin bouncing across the deck. The alarms triggered again across the cramped station. Krasis, who alone had managed to stay in his seat, deactivated them without comment. The view screen had gone offline completely, showing nothing but gray static. They're going to board us?" Ancom stammered as they picked themselves up. Any response was lost in another jarring impact. The station's frame shrieked in protest at the stresses put upon it. With their systems scrambled and broken, it was impossible to tell exactly where they were or what was happening outside. The station seemed to settle slightly, the sounds of tortured metal reduced to a low creak. They all scanned the ceiling, looking for any sign of a breach. "Do you hear that?" Serene said. It was the first time she'd spoken since seeing the bioship. They all listened, breath held, straining to hear over the groan of adamantium and Corday's muted sobs. Eventually, Davrick caught what Serene had detected, a faint scratching, scrabbling noise, as though someone or something was scraping across the outside of the hull. It mirrored the scratching tormenting all of them from inside their own skulls. "They're on the hull," Davrick said. Before he could go on, a crash shattered the breathless quiet. The section directly above Krasis's chair, in the center of the station's cockpit, collapsed. With it came a flood of broiling green liquid that struck Krasis just as he looked up. If the old Sensorum Master managed to draw breath to scream, The bioacid flooded his mouth, throat, and lungs before he could make a sound. Davrik caught an impression of his death as he was lost entirely in the torrent flesh, sloughing from bones, organics consumed in a heartbeat. The rest of the crew recoiled, but too slowly. Serene, nearest to the center of the cockpit, was struck by the acidic spray. Her hands went up to her exposed face, and her screaming filled the claustrophobic space. "No!" Ankam wailed, lunging across his bench to catch the auger analyst as she collapsed. He managed to drag her hands away from her face, then recoiled. Her features had already been reduced to pockmarked bone, her eyeballs running like liquid from their sockets, meat and tendons slipping away with her fingers. Still, she screamed. Ankam doubled over and was sick. Davrik, whose station was furthest from Crassus's chair, scrambled back on top of his bench as the flood of acid spread across the decking plates. Serene had collapsed into the rising swill, her body coming apart. Ankam tried to push himself against his vox banks, but was sick again, and collapsed. The bugs got to him before the acid. There were insects in the hissing, steaming, slime-writhing, sightless maggot things with hard black shells. They swarmed from the discolored vomit-like biomatter, the air full of the susurration of their passing as they swiftly covered the deck, and then the cogitator stations, workbenches, and walls, riding the rising tide of acid. First hundreds and then thousands of them reached Ankam, swarming over his boots and knees and up his arms where he was crouched against the vox systems. He tried to scream, but choked on his own bile. His eyes rolled back into their sockets as the alien swarm began eating him alive. Corday killed himself. Face still streaked with tears, he leapt directly from his bench into the stream that had consumed Crassus and his command chair. He was gone in an instant, as the breach in the station hull was burned wider. As Ankam's eaten-out remains collapsed into the bioorganics sloshing about the cockpit's deck, Davrik stood rooted to the top of his bench. He couldn't think, couldn't move. He was in the throes of panic. A part of him realized he should end it quickly like Corday, but another part was desperate for another way out, any way out that avoided the nightmare bile that was burning away everything. It was digesting them whole. Even as the terror kept him in place, Grohl's binary chair collapsed, pitching the unresponsive tech adept into the effluvium. His red cloak billowed for a moment before he was lost, coming apart amidst the steaming clouds of liquefied organics. For a moment, Davrik was alone. For a single, ludicrous second, everything felt surreal, ridiculous, almost calm. It had to be a nightmare. None of this horror could possibly be real. Then his bench collapsed. "Oh God, Emperor, no!" he screamed, trying to scramble back onto the plastile's disintegrating remains. "No, no, no!" The bioacid caught him, sloshing around his boots and his lower fatigues. His panicked wails quickly turned to screams of agony as the material was eaten away, exposing flesh that in turn began to slough off. Muscle and sinew became gray, organic paste that revealed bone that gave way and splintered beneath its own acid-gnawed weight. Davrik died slowly, on his knees, eaten up inch by the bile and the sightless, burrowing things that swam in it. Eventually, the insects flooded his raw throat, choking and suffocating him as they ate out his eyes and bored through his nose and ears and into his brain. The acid took what remained. As another section of the hull caved to emit a fresh gout of vicious toxins, the picture of Amelia and Drewy fell from the side of Davrik's primary view screen into the flood. In an instant, the smiling wife and son were gone, consumed entirely.
And if you don't mind me, I'll be over here in the corner celebrating the death of my own innocence.
Why, Papa? I can still hear the screams, Papa!